The starting point for measuring and describing body movement is the static body itself. Those of you who have learned pattern grading have explored anthropometrics, which is the study of the measurements of the body in static positions, as well as the way that those measurements vary across a population. We'll review some of that here, but with a focus on how these measurements form the basis of understanding the body in motion. For the purposes of studying or describing movement, we usually start from what's known as the anatomical position, the basic position that's used as a reference point to describe positions or movements that are different from this basic position. You can see that it's basically a straight body position. It's not exactly relaxed, since many joints are slightly bent in the relaxed position. And remember that in the anatomical position, the palms are facing forward. We'll return to the anatomical position when we talk about describing movements in technical terms. For now, remember that this is one common position that bodies are measured in, but static anthropometry can be done in any number of standardized positions. Anthropometry is interested in capturing the dimensions of the human body and the way these dimensions change across a population. Of course, there's an almost infinite array of dimensions that can be measured from a body. We'll categorize them into a few types. Linear measurements, straight lines from one side of a body part to another, are usually captured using calipers or anthropometers like these. To get at areas that are tricky to reach with a straight caliper, different end shapes or curved spreading calipers can be used. Tape measures are commonly used to measure surface distances and circumferences. Special adapted tapes can be used to measure hard-to-reach areas like the fingers. Rulers and stadiometers are used to capture heights and vertical distances. In the late 1800s, before fingerprints were widely understood, it was thought that you could identify a person uniquely by a set of body measurements. In order to capture many measurements simultaneously, some interesting devices were developed. Nowadays, the 3D body scanner does this much more quickly. There are many different kinds of body scanners, but they typically use reflected light to capture a point cloud that defines the surface of the body. From that surface, any number of measurements can be taken after the fact. Some body scanners are stationary and installed in a room. Others are handheld and operated by moving the scanner around the subject. All body scanners produce a 3D image of the body. It's important to remember that the surface that's captured is like a rigid shell in the image. It can't be manipulated afterwards. So things like wrinkles in clothing are a permanent part of the shape that's captured. It's important to pay attention to the subject's posture as well as any sources of interference that will end up on the surface of the scan, like hair or loose clothing. Trying to capture seated positions is particularly difficult because the chair can block the scanner's light from reaching the body's surface. This scan was taken through a translucent surface. To capture the dimensions of one body, it may be feasible to measure that body yourself or to measure from a 3D scan of that body. However, if you need to understand the way that body shapes and dimensions change across a population, for example, if you're trying to make sure your product fits a whole population, you may need to rely on a set of measurements that somebody else has already collected from a large number of people. For some applications, you may be interested in knowing the spread of a dimension. For example, how small the smallest waist is and how big the biggest waist is, or how big the average or mean waist is. Dimensions are often separated into percentiles, describing the average measurement for each segment of the population. Fit specifications often require that a product fit from the 5th percentile to the 95th percentile, meaning that it should fit people down to the smallest 5% of a population and up to the largest 95%. There are many published sources available that will summarize this kind of spread of a dimension, and several also separate out a given population into subsets by age or gender or other characteristics. Some examples of these sources that are available in our library are the human scale references, which are available only at the McGraw Reference Desk, a book called The Measure of Man and Woman, or NASA's Anthropometrics source book, which contains measurements of astronauts. There's one big problem with looking at the distribution of individual measurements across a population. It's tempting to assume that a woman, say in the 15th percentile, is in the 15th percentile for all of her body measurements. This is almost never true. One person may be in the 5th percentile for foot length and the 80th percentile for arm length and the 25th percentile for waist circumference, and so on. If you're interested in investigating multiple dimensions on one person, you need to use a source that relates individual measurements to individual subjects. Usually this is some kind of anthropometric database. There are several of these databases that exist, and some are more accessible than others. One that we commonly use is the ANSWER database, which is a database of about 2,000 men and 2,000 women, all U.S. Army personnel, who were measured in a 1988 government study. The commonly available downloadable versions of the database contain 132 measurements recorded for each subject. However, it's important to remember that ANSWER is a military population and that the dimensions of military bodies are fairly different than the entire population. Beyond this, it's also a U.S. population, it's also an adult population, and many other constraints that exclude parts of the full range of human bodies that exist. With any anthropometric investigation, you need to consider whether the source of your data matches your target population. Another dataset that we have access to here is the CSER database, the Civilian, American, and European Surface Anthropometry Resource Project, which surveyed 2,400 US and Canadian subjects and 2,000 European subjects. This is actually a database of 3D scans, meaning that it's possible to measure almost any dimension you're interested in from these scans, although it takes a long time to collect that kind of data. The database also has a set of pre-measured dimensions that are collected from each of these scans and aggregated in an easier-to-use format. CSER is a civilian database, so the population it covers is much broader than ANSWER, and it was completed in 2000, so it's a little more recent.